Yes, subliminal messages. 1957, Vance Packard published The Hidden Persuaders, an expose of Madison Avenue. As the book climbed the bestseller list, it awakened in the public a fear of being manipulated by forces they could not see or hear. What had Packard uncovered? In the 1950s, amid growing fears of communism and the birth of rock and roll, a number of advertisers were said to have used subliminal messaging, or advertising, the presentation of commercial messages outside of conscious awareness. Okay, so I'm going to highlight that because even though it's not a key term, it's a key term. All right, subliminal advertising is the presentation of commercial messages outside. Okay. It all started in a drive-in movie theater in New Jersey, where the words "drink Coke" and "eat popcorn" were secretly flashed on the screen during intermissions for a third of a millisecond. Although the audience never noticed the message, Coke sales were said to have increased 18%, and popcorn sales 58% over a 6-week period. This incident was followed by several others. A Seattle radio station presented sub-audible anti-TV messages during its programs. TV is a bore. And department stores played music tapes over public address systems that contained sub-audible warnings about theft. If you steal, you'll get caught. Years later, in books titled Subliminal Seduction and the Age of Manipulation, William Bryan Key charged that advertisers routinely sneak fake sexual images in visual ads to heighten the appeal of their products. And I mean, now it's much more overt, but back then, I believe it. At the time, the story about the New Jersey theater broke. At the time the story about the New Jersey theater broke, research on the topic was so sketchy and the public so outraged by the sinister implications that the matter was quickly dropped. But soon, there was renewed interest in subliminal influences and new research developments. In one recent study, for example, researchers played traditional German or French music on alternating days for 2 weeks at a supermarket display of wines. Keeping track of sales, the researchers found that of the total number of wines bought, 83% were German on German music days, and 65% were French on French music days. Yet, when asked the reasons for their choices, customers did not cite the music as a factor, suggesting that they were not aware of the effect that it had had on them. Current uses of subliminal influence are varied. In what is now a multi-million-dollar industry, companies today sell mobile self-help apps and MP3 downloads that play New Age music or nature sounds, and also contain fleeting messages or affirmations that promise to help you relax, lose weight, raise self-esteem, make money, improve athletic performance, and even improve your sex life. And hell. Can subliminal messages reflexively trigger behavior without our awareness? In 1982, Timothy Moore reviewed the existing research and concluded, what you see is what you get. Nothing. Complete scams. Moore was right. The original story about the Coke and popcorn messages at the New Jersey theater was later exposed as a publicity stunt and hoax. To further complicate matters, controlled experiments using subliminal self-help materials that promise to raise self-esteem, improve memory, or lose weight show that these products offer no therapeutic benefits. I think that's the most important thing out of all these paragraphs that we just read. Yeah. If there is no solid evidence of subliminal influence, Why, you may wonder, does research demonstrate perception without awareness in studies of priming, described elsewhere in the book, but not in studies of subliminal persuasion? If you think about it, the two sets of claims are different. In the laboratory, subliminal exposures have a short-term effect on simple judgments and actions. That's important. I'm going to highlight that. But in claims of subliminal persuasion, the exposure is presumed to have long-term effects on eating, drinking, consumer purchases, voter sentiment, or even the most profound of violent acts, suicide. Okay, I'm going to highlight that sentence too, because it's talking about the difference between the two. That's critical. Psychologists agree that people can process information at an unconscious level, but they're quick to caution that this processing is analytically limited. I think I'm going to highlight that too. That's critical. Perhaps people perceive subliminal cues, but are not persuaded into action unless they're motivated to do so. To test this hypothesis, Aaron Strahan, or Strahan, Aaron Strahan, whatever, Aaron Strahan, I think. Aaron Strahan and others in 2002 brought thirsty college students into the laboratory for a marketing study and provided drinking water to some, but not to others. Then, as part of a test administered by computer, they subliminally exposed these students to neutral words like pirate or won, like victory won, not the number, or to thirst-related words like thirst, dry. Did the subliminal thirsty message later lead the students, like automatons, to drink more in a taste test of Kool-Aid beverages? Yes and no. Figure 611 shows that the subliminal thirst primes had little impact on the students whose thirst had just been quenched with water, but they quite clearly increased consumption among those who were thirsty and had been deprived of water. Okay. Yeah, you can see it. It's a significant difference between the thirsty and barely any difference between the not thirsties. And they're showing this in milliliters drank without showing it all the way to 0. So keep that in mind, that sometimes when you look at graphs and data like this, it can be slightly skewed based off of how they make these charts. So this one only shows 120 milliliters all the way to 200 milliliters. But if it showed all 200 milliliters, all the way to 200 milliliters down to the bottom, and you looked at the difference between 160 and 150, it's marginal, the difference between them. But the difference between 200 and 135, that's critical. Yeah, I'd check that figure out. It's pretty cool. Okay, anyway, point. For a subliminal message to influence behavior, it has to strike while the iron is hot. It's a really good expression, and it sums it up fairly well. So I think I'm going to highlight that as opposed to the more long-winded part. Yeah, and the first one. People perceive subliminal cues but are not persuaded into action unless they are motivated to do so. So your motivations make a difference in how you perceive subliminal cues and if they persuade you or not. Other researchers have since extended this interesting effect in important ways. In one study, participants who were subliminally presented with the name of a specific soft drink, Lipton Ice, were later more likely to report that they would select that particular brand over others, provided that they were thirsty. In a second study, participants were subliminally presented with a logo for one brand of dextrose, a sugar pill, or another, after which they worked on a cognitive task that required intense concentration. The results showed that when given an opportunity to enhance their concentration, participants were more likely to select and consume the subliminally advertised brand than the other brand, provided that they were mentally tired and in need of a boost. Yeah, I think those are just two other examples. I'm going to put the little next to it of the same thing. So, now we talk about the audience. Although source and message factors are important, astute communicators must also take their audience into account. Important. Presentation strategies that succeed with some people fail with others. Audiences on the central route to persuasion, for example, bear little resemblance to those found strolling along the peripheral route. In this section, we'll see that the impact of a message is influenced by two additional factors: the recipient's personality and his or her expectations. Two additional factors. Okay, so right from the start, social psychologists tried to identify types of people who were more or less vulnerable to persuasion, but it turned out that very few individuals are consistently easy or difficult to persuade. That sounds important. Based on this insight, the search for individual and group differences is now guided by an interactionist perspective. Assuming that each of us can be persuaded more in some settings than in others, researchers look for an appropriate match between characteristics of the message and of the audience. Okay, so interactionist perspective. Researchers look for an appropriate match between characteristics of the message and audience. Okay, so what kinds of messages turn you on? Oh, I love when they leave it on a cliffhanger. All right, we're going to the section, the need for cognition. Earlier, we saw that people tend to process information more carefully when they are highly involved. Involvement can be determined by the importance and self-relevance of a message. According to Cacioppo and Petty in 1982, however, there are also individual differences in the extent to which people become involved and take the central route to persuasion. Specifically, they have found that individuals differ in the extent to which they enjoy and participate in effortful cognitive activities, or as they call it, the need for cognition, NC. That's a definition. That's true, because there are people who they really want that stuff that challenges their brain and challenges their perceptions and really makes them chew on what they're thinking about. And some of us just need a break. And sometimes we float between the two, so that makes a huge difference. Yeah, okay. People who are higher rather than low in their need for cognition like to work on hard problems, search for clues, make fine distinctions, and analyze situations. These differences can be identified by the items contained in the need for cognition scale, some of which appear in Table 6.2. I have a feeling that people who like escape rooms, the kind of puzzle type games, the really involved RPG games, that kind of thing, fit in the need for cognition. Okay, so some of the questions that they ask you to find out where you go on the need for cognition scale are: I really enjoy a task that involves coming up with new solutions to problems. Thinking is not my idea of fun. The notion of thinking abstractly is appealing to me. I like tasks that require little thought once I've learned them. I usually end up deliberating about issues even when they do not affect me personally. It's enough for me that something gets the job done. I don't care how or why it works. Okay, so I think they've outlined that 2, 4, and 6 makes you not a need for cognition person, and that 1, 3, and 5 does. But yeah, okay, so take from that what you will. I think from this paragraph, involvement can be determined by the importance and self-relevance of a message. Yeah. Okay. The need for cognition has interesting implications for changing attitudes. If people are prone to approach or avoid effortful cognitive activities, then a communicator could prepare messages unique to a particular audience. Sorry, I'm going to read that again. It has interesting implications for changing attitudes. If people are prone to approach or avoid effortful cognitive activities, then a communicator could prepare messages unique to a particular audience. In theory, the high NC audience would receive information-oriented appeals, and the low NC audience should be treated to appeals that rely only on the use of peripheral cues. The theory is fine, but does it work? Can a message be customized to fit the information processing style of its recipients? In a test of this hypothesis, participants read an editorial that consisted of either a strong or a weak set of arguments. As predicted, the higher their NC scores were, the more the participants thought about the material. The better they later recalled it, and the more persuaded they were by the strength of its arguments. In contrast, people who are low in the need for cognition are persuaded by cues found along the peripheral routes, such as a speaker's reputation or the physical appearance, the overt reactions of others in the audience, and a positive mood state. At times, they're mindlessly influenced by a reputable source, even when his or her own arguments are weak. Okay, so that whole last paragraph essentially says, yes, research indicates that that is the case, that you can customize to fit the information processing styles of the recipients, so I'm going to highlight that. A communicator could prepare messages unique to a particular audience, customized to fit the information processing style of its recipients. Yeah, just those two. I think I'm going to splice those together into one point in my notes. Okay, self-monitoring. Monitoring. Just as people high in the need for cognition crave information, other personality traits are associated with an attraction to other kinds of messages. Consider the trait of self-monitoring. As described in Chapter 3, high self-monitors regulate their behavior from one situation to another out of concern for public self-presentation. Yep, that's getting highlighted. Trait of self-monitoring is where they regulate their behavior from one situation to another out of concern for public self-presentation. Low self-monitors are less image conscious and behave according to their own beliefs, values, and preferences. I'll highlight that too. In the context of persuasion, high self-monitors may be particularly responsive to messages that promote desirable social images. Whether the product is beer, soft drinks, blue jeans, cars, or smartphones, this technique is common in advertising where often the image is the message. Yeah. Who wants to drink this if all the cool kids are drinking that? Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so to test the self-monitoring hypothesis, Mark Snyder and Kenneth DeBono in 1985 showed image or information-oriented print ads to high and low self-monitors. In an ad for Irish Mocha Mint coffee, for example, a man and a woman were depicted as relaxing in a candlelit room over a steamy cup of coffee. The image-oriented version promised to make a chilly night become a cozy evening, while the informational version offered a delicious blend of 3 great flavors: coffee, chocolate, and mint. As predicted, high self-monitors were willing to pay more for products after reading imagery ads. Low self-monitors were influenced more by information-oriented appeals. Smith and DeBono in 2011 found a similar result for energy drinks. They found that high self-monitors rated the drinks more favorably when they had an image-oriented name. Low self-monitors preferred the drinks more when they had a self-descriptive name. Imagery can even influence the way that high self-monitors evaluate a product, independent of its quality. DeBono and others in 2003 presented people with one of 2 perfume samples packaged in more or less attractive bottles. Whereas low self-monitors prefer the more pleasant scented fragrance, the high self-monitors preferred whatever scent came in the more attractive bottles. Wow, okay, so there's a lot of meat in here. Yeah. But they're all examples. And they're all good. So I think I'm just going to put the study mark on here because they're all really good. You could pull any of these examples from here to explain that. Yeah, okay. So regulatory fit. Setting aside your political views. I'm sorry, I'm tired, guys. It's time for me to go to bed. Setting aside your political views, do you find yourself drawn to some types of speeches, arguments, and editorials and television commercials more than others? Joseph Cesario and others in 2004 proposed that people are more likely to be influenced by messages that fit their frame of mind and feel right. In particular, they noted that in an effort to regulate their own emotion state, some individuals are promotion-oriented, as in they are drawn to the pursuit of success or achievement or their ideals, whereas others are more prevention-oriented, protective of what they have, fearful of failure, vigilant about avoiding loss. Okay, that's huge. In an effort to regulate their own emotional state, some individuals are promotion-oriented, whereas others are more prevention-oriented. I think that's the more long-winded one, but I like it a little bit better than the sentence before where he says people are more likely to be influenced by messages that fit their frame of mind. Because I like the examples that they've given in each one. I think that's going to be critical. Okay, so do these differing outlooks on life make people more responsive to some types of persuasive messages than others? To find out, these researchers presented 2 versions of an article advocating for a new after-school children's program. They found that promotion-motivated participants were more persuaded by the article when the arguments were in it were framed in promotional terms, because it will advance your children's education. It will support more children to succeed. While prevention-motivated participants were persuaded more by the very same arguments framed in more defensive terms, because it will secure your children's education, prevent more children from failing. In a follow-up study, Cesario and Higgins in 2008 found that audience members are also influenced when a speaker's nonverbal style fits their motivational orientations. Watching a high school teacher deliver the same communication about a new after-school program, promotion-motivated participants were more receptive when the speaker exhibited an eager delivery style, fast, animated, and forward-leaning with hand gestures projecting outward, whereas prevention-oriented participants were more receptive when he displayed a cautious style, slow, precise, backward-leaning with hand gestures pushing in. That's interesting. In France, in the context of messages that advertised a healthy diet, Lucia Bozzone and others in 2015 also found that persuasion is maximized when there is a regulatory effect between the audience members and a role model whose approach is either positive, always very healthy thanks to a balanced diet, or negative, always sick because of an unbalanced diet. Okay, so I think all of this second paragraph that we just read are examples. They're really great examples, but I think the best sentence is from the first paragraph that we read after the first regulatory fit. Sorry, I read two paragraphs. Okay, so in that first that we just read, I think the most important one was promotion motivated were more persuaded by arguments that were framed promotionally, and prevention more persuaded in defensive terms. All right, forewarning and resistance. When our attitudes come under attack, we can succumb and change the attitude, or we can resist and maintain the attitude. There are different ways to resist. In a series of studies, Julia Jacks and Kimberly Cameron in 2003 asked people to describe how they managed to resist persuasion in their attitudes on abortion or the death penalty. They identified 7 strategies, the most common being attitude bolstering, as in, I think about all the reasons I believe the way I do. And the least common source was derogation. I look for faults in the person who challenges my belief. These means of resistance are listed all in Table 6.3. So there's attitude bolstering. I reassure myself of facts that support the validity of my belief. There's counter-arguing. I would talk to myself and play devil's advocate. Social validation. I also rely on others with the same opinion to be there for me. I guess the example of that would be somebody is attacking me on Facebook and they're bringing up this point against what I believe. I'm going to tag my friend who also feels the same way as me and like, hey, this person is challenging this. And that person can come to my aid kind of situation. A negative effect strategy is I tend to get angry when someone tries to change my beliefs. I think that one's self-explanatory. Assertions of confidence. I doubt anyone could change my viewpoint. I guess that's just where you you come off on the defensive talking about how confident you are, I guess. All right, selective exposure. Most of the time I just ignore them. Yep. Block. I just don't have to talk to people I disagree with. It's fine. And in some cases, super valid, especially when they're being derogatory and condescending. Source derogation. They talked about that, looking for faults in the person rather than in their argument. Okay, so what leads people to resist? Actually, let's highlight what we're going to highlight in this thing. Identified 7 strategies. The most common being attitude, bolstering, the least common being source derogation. I have a feeling he's going to sneak one of those in. What? Yeah, but what's the most? But what's the least? Okay, so what leads people to resist? Does it help to be forewarned that your attitude is about to come under attack? Perhaps the toughest audience to persuade is the one that knows you're coming. Sorry, I'm also highlighting the strategies in the table so that I don't forget about them. Yeah, perhaps the toughest audience to persuade is the one that knows you're coming. When people know that someone is trying to change their attitude, they become resistant. All they need is some time to collect their thoughts and come up with a good defense. Jonathan Friedman and David Sears in 1965 first discovered this when they told high school seniors to expect a speech on why teenagers should not be allowed to drive. Very unpopular position, as you can imagine. The students were warned either 2 or 10 minutes before the talk began, or not at all. Those who were the victims of a sneak attack were the most likely to succumb to the speaker's position, but those who had a full 10 minutes of warning were the least likely to agree. So I think when people know someone is trying to change their attitude, they become resistant. All they need is time to collect their thoughts and come up with a good defense. Be forewarned. To be forewarned is to be forearmed. But why? 2 processes are at work here. Participants in the Friedman and Sears in 1965 study were put on a notice in 2 ways. They were either informed of the position the speaker would take, or 2, they were told the speaker intended to change their opinion. Psychologically, these 2 aspects of forewarning have different effects. Okay. 2 processes. Yeah, I think 2 aspects of forewarning have different effects. And I think they're going to talk about them enough in the following paragraphs that when we make our notes afterwards, we can just put those within the bullets. Okay, the first effect is purely cognitive. Knowing in advance what position a speaker will take enables us to come up with counter arguments. Yeah, I think I'm going to highlight that second sentence. William McGuire in 1964 drew this analogy. Protecting a person's attitude from persuasion, he said, is like inoculating the human body against disease. In medicine, injecting a small dose of infection into a patient stimulates the body to build up a defense to it. According to this inoculation hypothesis, an attitude can be immunized the same way. That's a key term, inoculation hypothesis. As with flu shots and other vaccines, our defenses can be reinforced by exposure to weak doses of the opposing position before we actually encounter the full presentation. Studies of negative political ads show that inoculation can be used to combat the kinds of attack messages that sometimes win elections. I guess that's also the idea of oh, my opponent has found out something about me that could potentially make me look bad, especially if they can frame it however they want. So to combat that, I'm going to inoculate the people that I want to vote for me with the true information, simply, blatantly put, and that way they can bolster up against people who disagree with me and are going to try to argue against me on those specific points. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Simply knowing that someone is trying to persuade us also sparks a motivational reaction as we embrace ourselves regardless of what position is taken. Okay, so motivational reaction. No, I think I'm just going to highlight that whole sentence. Yeah. Imagine taking part in a research project. How would you feel if the experimenter said to you, in just a few minutes, you'll hear a message prepared according to well-established principles of persuasion designed to induce you to change your attitudes? If you're like the participants who actually heard this warning, you might be tempted to reply, oh yeah, try me. Indeed, participants rejected that message without counter-argument and without much advance notice. When people think that someone is trying to change their attitude or otherwise manipulate them, red flags go up. This red flag is called psychological reactance. Another key term. The theory that people react against threats to their freedom by asserting themselves and perceiving the threatened freedom as more attractive. According to Jack Brem's theory in 1956 of psychological reactance, each of us seeks to protect our own autonomy. That's a really good way of putting it. Each of us seeks to protect our own autonomy. We want the freedom to think, feel, and act as we, not others, choose. Dang, that one's good too. I like that too. When we sense that a cherished freedom is being threatened, we become motivated to maintain it. I want to highlight that as well. Not going to do it. Okay. When we sense that a freedom is slipping away, we try to restore it. Ooh, this whole paragraph, man. It's going to make me highlighter happy. Okay, reactance theory predicts that if a communicator comes on too strongly, we may react with negative attitude change by moving to the opposite direction of the position being advocated. Negative attitude change by moving to the opposite direction of the position being advocated. Even ironically, when the speaker's position agrees with our own. Sometimes the motive to protect our freedom to think, feel, and act as we choose trumps our desire to hold a specific opinion. Interesting. Yeah, they're coming too strong. Sus. All right, so the motive to protect our freedom to think, feel, and act as we choose trumps our desire to hold a specific opinion. All right, reactance can trigger resistance to persuasion in two ways. Once aroused, the reactant target of attempted persuasion may simply shut down in a reflex-like response, or disagree in a more thoughtful manner by questioning the credibility of the source and counter-arguing the message. Okay. I like that. So with reactance, it either simply shuts down or disagrees in a more thoughtful manner by questioning the credibility of the source and counter-arguing the message. At this point, more than 50 years of research has shown that reactance is a measurably powerful motive. It is activated when we fear a loss of freedom on a personally important issue. It is stronger in some individuals than others, and it can lead us to generate counter-arguments and resistance in response to a persuasive message. Dang, that's a meaty sentence. I think I'm going to highlight that too, that last one. Okay, culture and persuasion. A communication is persuasive to the extent that the source is favorable and the message, however it is presented, meets the psychological needs of its audience. In this regard, cultural factors also play a subtle but important role. I'm going to wait to highlight. In earlier chapters, we saw that cultures differ in the extent to which people are oriented toward individualism or collectivism. In light of these differences, Sang-Pil Han and Sharon Shavit in 1994 compared the contents of magazine advertisements in the United States, an individualistic country, and Korea, a country with a more collectivist orientation. They found that American advertising campaigns were focused more on personal benefits, individuality, competition, and self-improvement. She's got a style all her own, or make your way through the crowd. And that Korean ads appealed more to the integrity, achievement, and well-being of one's in-groups, an exhilarating way to provide for your family, or celebrating a half-century of partnership. Clearly, there are different ways to appeal to the members of these two cultures. In a second study, Han and Shavit created two sets of ads for various products. One set portrayed individuals, treat yourself to a breath-freshening experience, and the other set featured groups, share this breath-freshening experience. Both sets were presented to American and Korean participants. The results? The Americans were more persuaded by individualistic ads, and Koreans preferred collectivistic ads. Cultural orientation also influences our attitudes toward the things we buy. In one set of studies, Jiwen Hong and Hannah Chang in 1915. I'm being so rude right now, sorry. Jiwen Hong and Hannah Chang in 2015 primed an independence cultural orientation in some participants by having them read a passage that used only singular pronouns, I, me, my. They primed an interdependent orientation in other participants by presenting the same passage, but it was filled with plural pronouns, we, us, our. All participants then viewed descriptions of two apartments they might rent and were asked to decide which they preferred. Participants primed for independence relied on their feelings and picked an apartment that elicited the most positive affect. It had expansive views, more sunlight, better interior decor. In contrast, those that were primed for interdependence took a more cognitive approach and selected an apartment that was more practical. It was larger, or it had more closet space, or better access to public transportation. It appears that an independent orientation leads people to rely on their feelings because they make the decision for themselves, whereas an interdependent orientation leads people to rely on functionality because they make the decision for others. As people from all over the world come into contact with each other through travel, satellite television, international trade agreements, and the internet, cultural values begin to change. Sorry, I just realized I've powered through like 4 paragraphs. This one's meaty. Okay. I think cultures differ in the extent to which people are oriented toward individualism and collectivism. Sorry, I should have done this while it was fresh. Clearly, there are 2 different ways to appeal to members of 2 cultures. Cultural orientation influences our attitudes towards things we buy. Participants can be primed. To rely on feelings, or primed to take a more cognitive approach, more practical. Okay. I think this first sentence is important too. As there's more globalization through these different ways, cultural values begin to change. Just as humans develop as they get older, cultures sometimes change over time from one generation to the next. Recent and substantial modernization efforts in China, home to roughly 1 out of every 5 people on the planet, illustrates this point. There is so much recent change that Zhang and Cheviot in 2003 sought to compare the contents of television commercials, which are directed primarily at the traditional mass market, with advertisements in new magazines that specifically target 18 to 35-year-old, educated, high-income citizens who constitute China's X generation. Based on their analysis of 463 ads, they found that although traditional and collectivist values dominated on mainstream TV, magazine ads were characterized by more modern and individualistic impulses. So to be persuasive, a message should appeal to the culturally shared values of its audience. Okay. 3 more pages, I think. Yeah, we can do 3 more pages. All right. We are now in section 6.3, persuasion by our own actions. Anyone who has ever acted on stage knows how easy it is to become so absorbed in a role that the experience seems real. Fake laughter can make an actor feel happy, and crocodile tears can sometimes turn into sadness. Even in the high stakes of real life, the effect can be dramatic. I have to say, since my associate's degree is in theater, this is specifically a phenomenon that you find with actors who are method actors. If you treat acting like play pretend time, your mood is not affected by how you pretend. Or maybe that's just me and I'm divorcing it, and now that I think about that, my perspective is situational. It's a case study example. It's anecdotal. But in my experience, the only people who get depressed while playing a depressed character are those who are method actors. I could be wrong, but that's the majority of them. So Like everything else in this book, it depends. Okay, so even in the high stakes of real life, the effect can be dramatic. In 1974, Patty Hearst, a sheltered college student from a wealthy California family, was kidnapped. By the time she was arrested months later, she was a gun-toting revolutionary who called herself Tanya. How could someone be so totally converted? Reflecting back, Hearst said, I had thought I was humoring my captors by parroting their cliches and buzzwords without believing in them. I was trying to convince them. In trying to convince them, I convinced myself. Oh, dang, that's potent. I think I'm going to put the little, because that's potent. Easy it is to become absorbed in a role. But the experience seems real. Okay, so role-playing. All the world's a stage. The Patty Hearst case illustrates the powerful effects of role-playing. Of course, you don't have to be kidnapped or terrorized to know how it feels to be coaxed into behavior that is at odds with your sense of who you are. People frequently engage in attitude discrepant behavior as part of a job, for example, or to fit into a group. Of course I can serve you. Absolutely. The customer is always right. Yeah. As part of a job, for example, or to fit into a group. Yeah, like you see a lot of people who really want to get into a gang or a pretty terrible fraternity or sorority that do horrible things to each other or to people in the community. And so part of initiation or part of proving that you're part of the in-group, you have to do things that you would never do in any normal social situation. Yeah, those are extreme, and not every single one is like that, but extreme situations get an extreme example. Okay, so as common as this seems, it raises a profound question when we play along, saying and doing things that are privately discrepant from our own attitudes. Do we begin to change those attitudes as a result? How we feel can determine the way we act. It is also possible that the way we act can determine how we feel. I guess that's the question about the fake it till you make it kind of thing. Can you practice something so many times that it becomes real for you? Okay. I think I'm going to highlight those two last sentences. Irving Janis in 1968 theorized that attitude change would persist more when it is inspired by our own behavior than when it stems from passive exposure to persuasive communication. Janis conducted a study in which one group of participants listened to a speech that challenged their positions on a topic, and others were handed an outline and asked to give the speech themselves. As predicted, participants changed their attitudes more after giving the speech than after listening to it. According to Janis, role-playing works to change attitudes because it forces people to learn the message and give it persuasively. If you're being judged on how persuasive it is, yeah. People tend to remember arguments they come up with on their own better than they remember arguments provided to them by other people. In fact, attitude change is more enduring even when people who read a persuasive message merely expect that they will later have to communicate it to others. Okay, so they've outlined three key things about this. That if you give a speech versus listening to it, it changes your attitude. You remember the arguments better if you came up with it rather than if someone bird fed it to you. And the change lasts longer when you believe you're going to have to communicate it to others later. But there's more to role-playing than improved memory. The effects of enacting a role can be staggering, in part because it's so easy to confuse what we do or say with how we really feel. Think about the times you've dished out compliments you didn't mean, flashed a smile at someone you didn't like, or nodded your head to a statement you disagreed with. We often shade what we say just to please a particular listener. What's fascinating is not that we make adjustments to suit others, but that this role-playing has such powerful effects on our own private attitudes. In one study, for example, participants read about a man and then described him to someone else who supposedly liked or disliked him. As you might expect, their descriptions were more positive when their listener was favorably disposed. In the process, they also convinced themselves, at least to some extent. Saying is believing. Okay. We make adjustments to suit others. And that it has powerful effects on our private attitudes. Yeah. Recent research into this process of self-generated persuasion, highlight, has shown that more attitude change is produced by having people generate arguments themselves than listening passively to others make the same argument. Often, I think I'm just going to highlight that whole sentence. Often in life, people hold attitudes they wish they could change, as when we wish we could like a job more than we do, or our favorite junk foods less. In these instances, people may try to talk themselves deliberately into something they do not already believe. This finding raises an interesting question. What produces more change in attitude? Formulating arguments in order to convince yourself of something, or trying to convince someone else? The answer is, it depends. I love that. I'm going to highlight those. What produces more change? This or this? The answer is, it depends. In a series of experiments, researchers found that when college students were instructed to advocate for a policy that was largely consistent with their own attitudes, that their university's tuition would be lowered. More self-persuasion occurred when their intended audience was another student. Not knowing how their target felt about the issue, these students tried harder to generate good arguments and moved themselves in the process. However, when they were instructed to advocate for a position that they opposed, that tuition should be raised, more self-persuasion occurred among students who had sought to convince themselves as opposed to another student. Knowing full well that self-persuasion on the issue would be particularly challenging, these students tried harder and generated even better arguments. The kind of self-persuasion that occurs when people advocate for something, as when they play a role, is a fascinating process. Consider the implications. We know that attitudes influence behavior, as when people help those whom they like and hurt whom they dislike. But role-playing studies emphasize the flip side of the coin, that behavior can change attitudes. Yep, we're highlighting that. Role-playing studies emphasize the flip side of the coin, that behavior can change attitudes. Perhaps we come to like people because we've helped them, or we dislike people whom we've hurt. To change a person's inner feelings, then, maybe we should begin by focusing on their behavior. Why do people experience changes of attitude in response to changes in their own behavior? One answer to this question is provided by the theory of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance. Can we get through cognitive dissonance in time? No, I think we'll start cognitive dissonance tomorrow. But yeah, that's a good stopping point. We're at an hour anyway. All right. Thanks so much, everybody who could join. I'll talk to you guys tomorrow.